Hello guys, welcome back to this series where I'm sharing with you the key AWS services which you must know if you're going to take in an interview where AWS is your main cloud technology, and also if you are starting your journey in AWS or you're starting your cloud computing journey and you want to start using AWS. I'm listing some of those services which are important for you to know. This is a part of a series. You want to watch your other videos in this series to know which service to use in what case, or well, to know which service best matches a given job description which you have. So the focus of today's video, I'm walking you through the AWS continuous integration and continuous deployment technologies. How do companies, or well, if you are a company or if there is a company that is based fully on AWS services and they want to perform continuous integration and continuous deployment on the AWS cloud, what services are available for them to perform continuous integration and continuous deployment? Let's dive right into the key AWS CI/CD technologies. Now, the very first service which you have is the AWS Code Commit. AWS Code Commit acts like a version control system on the AWS platform. Just like we have other open source code management technologies like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, and all the like, AWS Code Commit is AWS native source code management service. And with this AWS Code Commit service, all the code which the developers produce in a local environment can be effectively managed and version controlled in the AWS Code Commit. So let's dive right into the console to see what AWS Code Commit looks like.
AWS console, and we are going to be looking at some of the continuous integration and continuous deployment services on AWS. So for us to begin, let's look at the AWS Code Commit service, which is used as a version control system on AWS. Once you're on the dashboard, all you need to do is to search for the service Code Commit, and you'll see Code Commit, and it says Code Commit to store code in private Git repository. So it's AWS or native repository which you can use to manage code. Now, once you're logged into the AWS Code Commit on the platform or on the console, we have AWS Code Commit can help you to create secure repositories for sharing your code in the cloud. So there are different things. You can manage repositories, you can manage approval roles, and well, all these services are found under the developer tools on AWS platform. So AWS, one of the benefits of Code Commit, it's fully managed, it's secure, highly available, and you can store anything. And then you can use related services like CodeStar, CodePipeline, AWS Cloud9. So these are some applications which can work with AWS Code Commit. So to create a repository on Code Commit, it's pretty straightforward. All you need to do is to click on Create Repository. Once you click on Create Repository, all that is required of you is to carve a repository. Let's take, for example, DevOps with Mike demo. So let's take, for example, DevOps with Mike demo repo, and all you also have to do is, after putting the name, it's optional for you to add a description to the repository. So oftentimes I can just copy the name and use as the same description for the repository, and then you can enable Code Guru Reviewer if you're interested. That's actually optional. Once you have put in these basic details, of course it's used to create your own repository system on AWS. So all you need to do is to click on Create. Once you click on Create, AWS is going to provision a new repository for you. So basically, the new repository has been created, and as you can see, it says success repository successfully created. You can create a notification rule for this repository. Basically, if you have to commit new codes into the repository, you might want to configure that using a service like EventBridge or CloudTrail. Now, also, once you set up the repository, just like GitHub, there are ways which you can use to connect to the repository. So you can do a Git clone if you want to have. You can connect with this repository through HTTPS, which is one of the main ways, and they give you all the steps which you can use to connect to this repository. So you need to have a particular Git version. You need to have Git credentials, which you can create with the IAM user. So you need to create Code Commit credentials for this IAM user on AWS IAM, and then you can probably clone this repository to begin to perform changes. Now, if you want to SSH into the repository, you have different options. If you are using a Mac operating system, these are ways which you can use to SSH into the repository. These are ways which you can use to SSH and have access to commit changes into this repository. If you are equally looking for the clone URL, you can also get them from here. So basically, Code Commit is one of the ways which we use on AWS to manage source code. So the equivalent of this Code Commit repository is, we have GitHub, we have Bitbucket, and all the others which you mentioned. So that is it for the AWS Code Commit.
The second AWS CI/CD service which I'm mentioning in this series is the AWS Code Build. AWS Code Build. And AWS Code Build is a build service on AWS which helps to build source code from these developers into fully managed deployable application or software packages. So rather than you provisioning build servers on AWS, perhaps maybe you launching an AWS EC2 instance and installing maybe Apache or Marvel or Gradle, with the AWS Code Build service, you can compile or you can package or you can build code built by several different programming languages. And also AWS gives you the ability, AWS Code Build gives you the ability to integrate other build tools like Apache, Maven, and Gradle, and other even open source technologies like Jenkins, which you can integrate to your build service. So for you to perform build service for your application source code to the final package, we have the AWS Code Build service.
So we are on the AWS console, and now we will look at the AWS Code Build service. Now Code Build basically gives the ability to build and test code. So after typing Code Build here in the service section, you see different options, and we have the option of Code Build. Now once you click on this Code Build, it will take you to the Code Build service which we have on AWS. So the Code Build helps you to build and test code with elastic scaling, and you pay only for the build time you use. So you don't necessarily need to pay for every time your code is running. All you need to do is to pay for the build time which you use. And these are some key benefits: elastic scaling, extensible pay as you go, and you can integrate it with CodeDeploy, Code Pipeline, and CodeStar. So once you are on Code Build, you can actually have build projects which are running, build history for projects which you've already created, and then you can set up some other metrics. And equally, you should note that the Code Build service is under the AWS developer tools. Now for you to create a build project is pretty straightforward. You click on create build project. When creating a build project, you need to specify some key requirements, and we are going to be seeing some of those things very briefly. So for example, if I want to create a build project to maybe do a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline, I can set up a build name for probably DevOps with Mike Code Build project. Now I actually just copy this name and use the same description. If you want that this build to be like, you want to build as one batch rather than building multiple or individually, you can enable batch build. And then equally, as far as setting up Code Build is concerned, you must specify where the source code is coming from. So if you want to check on AWS, you can store your source code, which will be built using AWS S3, using Code Commit, using GitHub, using Bitbucket, and even GitHub Enterprise. So assuming you store your code in your Code Commit repository, it's going to scan the AWS environment in this region for repositories which you already have. So assuming I take, for example, this particular repo, now once you did a commit on that repository, you must have a branch which is specified. So the branch which was used to push this particular repository was the main branch, and then there are some key things. We want to use a managed environment to run the instance, or to run the build, or you want to customize your own. So basically, oftentimes you just need to use the Amazon Linux, which is already pre-configured, and you want to use the standard runtime, and you can choose any recent Amazon Linux image. Now equally, you can specify if you have your code build or the build pipeline or the build script, the script which you'll be using, the build spec.yaml. If you have to perform build on Docker images, it's important that you enable this flag for Docker images. And equally, you need a service role which will have to be attached to that. Then now the build spec file is the manifest file which you have all the build instructions. So once you must specify a build spec file. Now in my Code Commit repository, there is a file called build spec.yaml. That is why I just need to copy that file or that name and put here, and that will signify the same. I equally have that file. So if you have some other specific or additional configurations, you want to specify the VPC where it should run. If you've passed some environment variables in your code, you need to specify all of them here. And then equally, once you've set that all up, if you want to enable login every time a build operation takes place, you can configure login with CloudWatch, and you can store the logs with S3. So it's just a very brief overview of what the Code Build service look like. So once you've set up all the necessary requirements for Code Build, what is left for you is to click on create a build project. Now once you create a build project, of course you have successfully created the build project, and you have details on the build. If you had to maybe share this build project, you can share, you can start the build, you can see the build history, build details, build triggers, and all of that. So assuming you want to build this project, you can still click on start build, and you can equally configure a notification for the particular repository. So when you click on start build, it's going to show you in progress, and then equally it will give you the logs. It will show the activities, or if you are running a given set of codes, the logs will show you all the various instructions that have been implemented in your build spec file. So basically this is what we have as far as AWS Code Build is concerned, and we can use this code build for our build servers in a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline. There's a whole project which we did with AWS CI/CD, which you can equally watch. So that is it for the AWS Code Build service.
Now, assuming your code has been effectively built and we now have the deployable application packages, you can store these application packages in the AWS Elastic Container Registry. So the next DevOps tool or the next CI/CD tool which I want to mention in this series is the AWS Elastic Container Registry. And the Elastic Container Registry gives you the ability or the possibility to store final container images of your already built application files. So immediately, if you're implementing a CI/CD pipeline, immediately CodeBuild service has effectively performed a build on your application source code. You want to store the final built images in a service like the Elastic Container Registry. So let's dive right into the AWS console so you have a feel of what the Elastic Container Registry is.
Once again, we are on the AWS console, and we have to look at the next service for CI/CD or continuous integration and continuous deployment, which is the Elastic Container Registry service. Now, the Elastic Container Registry service, the ECR, is a service which you can use to fully manage Docker Container Registry, or where you can share and deploy containerized applications. So this is AWS native container management service, as we mentioned, and we'll just be going straight into the ECR service. So once you click on this, it takes you to the Elastic Container Registry service, which, like I said, it helps you to share and deploy container software publicly or privately. And you can see here how it works. You write your code, you store in ECR, or once you perform a build using a service like CodeBuild, you store the final image here in ECR, and then you can run these containers or these images as containers and orchestrate them with different orchestrating services like ACS, like Elastic Container Service, or you can even run them on-prem. So these are some of the key benefits of the Elastic Container Service, ECR service. Now, once you're here, you can equally click on the hamburger menu. You can have a private registry, you can have a public registry, and you can view all your repositories on the AWS platform. So all you need to do to have a repository is to click on create or get started. Once you click on get started, you can specify if the repository is public or private, and then you have a URL that is given by default by AWS, which you can use to reference. So once you have this, you just need to configure your name. Say, let's say DevOps with Mike repo. So let's take DevOps in Mike repo. Now, once you've given a name, all you have to do, if you want to scan on push, like for every push that is being done, you want to scan the code, or you want to perform encryption, all these are services you can enable. Once you've put in all the necessary information, all you need to do is to click on create repository. Now, once you click on create repository, you successfully create the repository, and you have different uses. Now, what is very important for you to note is the repository URI, because this is what you can use to reference this repository in any given pipeline which you are building. And equally, you can view push commands. That means if you want to push image to this repository, so once you click on push commands, it will give you the various steps which you can use to push image to this particular repository. Once you have an image, you can build the image using Docker build command. You can tag the image maybe using Docker tag command, and you can equally push the image to your Docker Hub repository or to this ECR repository using the Docker push command. So that is how the ECR can be used as part of the continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline.
The next CI/CD technology which I'm mentioning in this series is the AWS Code Deploy. And AWS Code Deploy is AWS based deployment service which you can use to release your application code that maybe you have installed in your Elastic Container Registry, or from your build servers, or from your build pipelines into your environment or into your production environment. Okay, so the deployment service, which is AWS native, is the AWS Code Deploy. Let's dive right into the console and have a feel of what the AWS Code Deploy service is.
Once again, we're on the AWS dashboard, and the other service you mentioned for continuous integration and continuous deployment is the AWS Code Deploy service. Now, the AWS Code Deploy is to automate deployments. After you perform your build of your code and you have the container image, you might want to perform deployment of this code into a given set of environments. So once you click on Code Deploy service, it will now give you the opportunity to manage your deployment. So it's a service that helps you to automate deployment to maintain application uptime, and it's kind of like free if you're running it on EC2 or Lambda, or you can run it on-premise at a given rate. So these are some of the ways which you can use to run the CodeBuild service. So once you want to create an application, all you need to do is click on Create Application. So once you click on Create Application, you need to give the application name. Let's say, for example, DevOps with Mike app. Then you choose the compute platform. Do you want to run it on ECS or on-prem or Lambda? You choose Lambda, for example, and all you have to do is select Create Application. Now, once it's successfully created, you need to now create a deployment group, where the deployment group is where you add all the compute resources. Once you click on deployment group, you now have to specify all the requirements which CodeBuild will use to perform the deployment. So this is how you can use CodeBuild as one of the services to push the deployment of your application or of your images in an automated CI/CD pipeline.
The last AWS CI/CD service you want to mention is the AWS Code Pipeline. That is one of the flagship CI/CD tools which AWS has for the implementation of a continuous integration best practice on the AWS environment. So if you want to build a continuous integration and a continuous deployment pipeline in AWS Code Pipeline is that service for that purpose. Now, with the AWS Code Pipeline, you can integrate your source code from a service like AWS Code Build, and you can equally specify your code build service like AWS Code Build, or maybe if you're using an open source build server like Jenkins, you can specify Jenkins as your source for the code build. And equally, you have to specify your deployment, how you want to deploy your package or your already processed application. It might be using the AWS Code Deploy service, or using AWS Elastic Container Service, or using AWS Elastic Kubernetes Service. Whatever the deployment strategy is, you specify your deployment service, and the pipeline performs that continuous integration between the source code right from the developers through AWS Code Commit up to the deployment, maybe with AWS Code Deploy or with AWS Elastic Container Service. Thus, AWS Code Pipeline effectively completes the CI or the continuous integration of all the processes of your CI/CD tool.
We're on the AWS console, and now for us to see how Code Pipeline works, all you need to do is be on the services section. You can type Code Pipeline. You can type Code Pipeline, and like you said, Code Pipeline helps you to release software using continuous delivery. The pipeline actually gives the communication or interlinks or connects all the processes in the continuous integration and continuous deployment. So once you click on Create Pipeline, as you can see, it helps us to visualize and automate the different stages of your software release project or release process. Now, as far as the pipeline is concerned, it has many configurations which you need to do, and it's like I said, it's the last mile where you connect all the dots between continuous integration and continuous delivery. So once you click on Create Pipeline, you need to configure the pipeline name. So let's take, for example, DevOps with Mike Pipeline. So now, once you have the DevOps with Mike Pipeline, you need to configure, and you don't necessarily need to configure that. You can just add this new service role, and then you can take next. Now you must specify a source. Where will Code Pipeline receive all the source codes that is going to be performing the orchestration with? So maybe you stored your code in Code Commit or in ACR or Bitbucket or whatever the case, you must specify. So in our case, we stored our code in AWS Code Commit. Once you're on Code Commit, you need to specify the repository name. So let's say we choose Code Commit as a source provider. You need to specify the name where you store the code, and then you need to give the branch where you have a code stored. Basically, to set up the code pipeline, you need to configure the source stage, the build stage, the deploy stage, and the review stage. You need to give a pipeline name. Take for example DevOps with Mike. DevOps Mike pipeline. Now, once you click on DevOps Mike pipeline, next you need to configure the source. You can have the source on Code Commit, ECR, S3, Bitbucket, and so on. So let's assume you use Code Commit as your source provider. That is where you basically input all your artifacts, or your files, all your application, your pipeline scripts, and all that. Now, once you select Code Commit, you need to specify all the various repositories and all of that. So basically, this is how Code Pipeline is, and this is one of the main services which you can use for your continuous integration and continuous deployment on the AWS platform. Thank you, and see you when we are implementing the complete project for AWS CI/CD.
I hope this video was helpful to give you an understanding on how continuous integration and continuous deployment is performed on the AWS cloud. You also want to check the AWS common interview questions which I've answered as part of this series. And also, if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, hit the channel subscribe button right away and get subscribed, because other videos are coming up in this series to help you have a better understanding of AWS if you are a starter, or how you can use your experience on AWS to strive through your interviews. See you in our next video in this series.